Hi, my name is Arati and I'm a journalist at MediaNama. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the research presentations for the 2022 cohort of the Meta India Tech Scholars. Meta launched the program to provide a research and mentorship platform to law students who are keen to engage on contemporary questions of technology, law, and policy. The law firm Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas Co is supporting the program as a knowledge partner. Through this series, the scholars will show us how specific policy choices in the technology sector influence and impact India's tryst with the internet. For today's showcase, I'm delighted to introduce you to Kaartikay. Kaartikay is a final year law student at the National Law University, Delhi. His paper seeks to explore the launch of India's central bank digital currency and its interface with privacy laws. His interest is derived from his willingness to explore India's financial sector and its growing interface with law and technology. Karthikeya has interned with think tanks and law firms, participated in co curricular activities like debating, quizzing, and negotiation competitions, and published writings on a wide range of topics. He enjoys traveling, watching basketball, and reading in his free time, and he hopes to build a career in finance, law, and public policy. Thank you so much for being here, Karthikeya. Really look forward to hearing from you, and please feel free to take it ahead.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. So I'll just be sharing my presentation now. Uh, yes. So I hope that this is visible.
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to MediaNama, to Meta, to Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, and all the other partners of this wonderful program. It is an absolute honor for me to be on board. So, beginning with my main presentation, my topic, as already stated, is exploring India's digital currency and its launch. And just to give a brief background, the interest that I have in this particular topic is not only derived from my academic interests, as have already been talked about, but also sort of personal interests. Because as when I was young, I was always interested in investing in financial markets. And of course, law is something that I absolutely love and I'm doing as my profession also. So I think the moment that CBDCs were launched, it certainly like piqued my interest that this is something that is very exciting. This is something that has a lot of opportunity to change India's financial markets, to change India's economy. And I think from there on, I thought that this would be a wonderful project, a wonderful thing to work on and explore as my research project under the Meta India Tech Scholarship. Uh, so beginning firstly with, as I've already talked about the motivation, beginning secondly with the methodology. So as we know, CBDCs was a very novel project that the Indian Reserve Bank started conceptualizing. And under that, what basically happened, the kind of timeline of events is that RBI initially released a policy paper, and that policy paper kind of worked as the very foundation head on which the entire proposal of CBDCs was built on. And when I started this research project, which was back in around 2022, 23, so therein, there was not a lot of information which was available. But at the same time, this was also, as I've talked about, a project that had the capability or has the capability to change the entire Indian ecosystem. So the methodology that I adopted in consultation with my mentoring institution, which was Carnegie Endowment for Peace, was firstly to look at the literature which is available, and the literature functioned in form of the RBI policy document, which worked as my primary source, followed by various research projects, which various centers had bought out on debates on privacy, debates on tech, debates on how the financial market, how the fintech market in India is shaping up. And the second point that I adopted was to go ahead with the comparative approach. So basically, what that meant was that CBDCs had already been implemented or adopted by certain countries. For example, in South America, in Asia, in Europe. And I wanted to understand from their experiences, from their perspectives, as to how their project was going, and then use that understanding to gain an insight on how the Indian project is going to go and how it should go. So that is basically the methodology that I adopted. Now, following up with how I then proceeded with the methodology, the first thing was that, especially at the time when I started this project, there was not exactly a proper data protection bill that India had at that point. And the challenge that was in front of me was the fact was to identify what digital infrastructure is going to be used to actually regulate the CBDC ecosystem, because the RBI paper, it of course detailed a lot of things about how the economy is going to be impacted, how the technology is going to work, but there was not a lot of information on what legal infrastructure or digital infrastructure would be applicable to the CBDC ecosystem. So what I then looked at was the draft, which was at that time the draft, the draft data protection bill, and I use that to understand that if this bill is going to come into force, then how various provisions of that bill are going to interact with the CBDC project, how various various sections, various uh, provisions of that bill can regulate, can fill the gaps, or can manage the CBDC ecosystem better. And the second thing that I looked at was, as I've already talked about, under the comparative approach, I looked at two very specific case studies, which was firstly China and secondly Brazil. And the reason why I chose both of these countries is because I felt, and this is of course something my mentoring institution also nudged me towards, that both these countries have a fairly large population, and both these countries are also in the developing slash developed stage, so they are still in transition, much like India. So it would be a great comparative to look at both Brazil and China, and then go ahead and adapt or understand and learn from their approach, what they adopted, to see how it will impact India's own CBDC project. So coming to the recommendations and the findings, sorry, that I analyzed through my paper. So firstly, was the idea of privacy by design. So basically, the idea of privacy by design is that when you are building a digital project, when you are going ahead and building a product, the privacy should be thought of as the foundation head of that project. And when you are designing that entire project, the integration of privacy and its concerns should be there from the start. So you do not make the product first and then go ahead and state that, okay, this is XYZ law or XYZ privacy mechanism that I'm going to adopt. But alternatively, when you're building that project, you always think of what privacy metrics or how can you inbuild the privacy mechanism in that product. So what I stated firstly was that this approach, which was thought of in Canada basically, could be adopted and applied when RBI and other stakeholders are actually building and creating the CBDC infrastructure. And the privacy should be a very key concern when you are building that entire project. And what I also interestingly found was, particularly, there was a study in the European Union that found out that when users are using these digital currencies, or when users are going ahead and taking a decision on whether you want to go ahead and buy into the entire idea, privacy is the most important concern for these users. And what this inherently means is that if tomorrow the RBI, the government, the various stakeholders want this project to be successful, then it is very important to reassure the consumers that privacy is a fundamental metric that they have thought about, and privacy is something that has certainly been kept in mind. And that is my first recommendation. The second recommendation that I have is on the idea of legal loopholes. So as I already talked about, that at that particular point in time, we did have the data protection bill, we did have the draft of that bill. But at the same time, what I felt was that the draft was not robust enough to entirely deal with the idea of CBDC, because firstly, it was still a general data protection law that was coming about, and it did not obviously deal with virtual currencies. And we all saw during the time of when you had the entire craze of Bitcoin, the entire craze of cryptocurrencies, the idea of having security, the idea of having some sort of financial stake, and the idea of having some sort of legitimacy was very important in the entire discourse. And that is also one of the reasons why the central governments of various countries actually came about with CBDCs. It was inherently also because to give a counter to these cryptocurrencies and state that, okay, we have a state backed cryptocurrency also, we have a state backed digital currency also that you can look as an alternative to the private cryptocurrencies. So again, what was very important was plugging these loopholes. And what I've talked about is, firstly, there should be informed consent. And informed consent is not something that is entirely laid out in the data protection bill of India. And what this informed consent means is the fact that consumers should be very clearly aware of what they are signing up for whenever they are using a digital product, or whenever, as I'm talking about CBDCs. So what sort of data is going to be shared with the bank? What sort of data is going to be shared with the RBI? What sort of data is then going to be shared with the central government, or various businesses? So the idea of informed consent is something that should be inbuilt into CBDCs, and it is something that we should look at much more seriously even within our data protection bill. The second thing is the fact that there is not a lot of sort of protection to data, or the strengthening of the various institutional mechanisms that the data protection bill is going to create. And there is when I bring in my entire analysis of the comparative study also. So now just moving forward to the third metric, which is looking at the comparative study. And this is something that I particularly found very interesting when I was doing my entire project, was firstly coming to China. So China, of course, has the ECNY. And what the ECNY does is that it has something called managed anonymity. So basically what that means is that anonymity is something that is going to be guaranteed when you are taking digital transactions, and all the data whenever a transaction is happening is going to be encrypted and protected. And for any stakeholder to access that data, they would have to take consent from the central bank, stating the reasons why they want access to that data, or why they want access to that to the information of that particular transaction. And B, China also has a data protection act. So then it also becomes important for every stakeholder who's participating in the EU1 project to also adhere to that data protection bill, which of course we did not have at that particular point of time in India, but now we do have that as well. And another very interesting thing about China and its entire project is they also have very strict inbuilt AML and CFT requirements. So what this basically means is that they have a very stringent anti-money laundering requirement, in the sense that whenever there is any threat, or there is any even the danger of there being a security breach, or there being a threat to national security, then they have certain inbuilt AML and CFT norms, which is basically dealing with whenever a dangerous situation or whenever a threat to national security arises. And the second thing that I looked at then was the case study of Brazil. And Brazil, very interestingly, has a very robust legislation called the LGPD, which is, of course, in Latin. But it's basically the General Data Protection Act only, and it's built very heavily on Europe's own GDPR. And the entire ecosystem in Brazil is, because of that very strict act, very, very secure and very powerful in that case. So what then I analyzed through both these case studies is the fact that both China and Brazil have two very good factors, which of course in the case of China was the AML CFT requirements and the managed anonymity. And in case of Brazil, you have the entire LGPD infrastructure based on Europe's GDPR. And both these aspects is something that India needs to learn from. So whenever you're building a CBDC in India, the concern that could come about is because these are all digital transactions and they make the movement of money very easy. So tomorrow, if any dangerous actors are actually indulging in the transfer of funds through CBDC, then what is the metric or what is the measure that the government is going to build into this mechanism to ensure it doesn't happen? And that is something which we can learn from China. And secondly, to have a very robust infrastructure, because as I stated, privacy is one of the most important things whenever consumers are going ahead and deciding to take a call on whether they want to transfer their funds into CBDCs. And we can learn from Brazil's legislation. So these are two of the very significant aspects that I analyzed for my paper. And I think, lastly, coming to the last aspect of my paper, and of course, I'm not an economist, but I do feel that e-rupee has a lot of potential. It is a great tool of financial inclusion. And of course, if implemented rightly, I think it can create India into a very bright spot, right? Because India already with UPI infrastructure is already something that I think is one of the most beautiful success projects, because everyone from the ground to the very top uses UPI in a very seamless manner. And there were, of course, questions on what is the difference exactly between UPI and CBDC. But of course, like there are subtle differences in the sense that the CBDC is actually a digital currency which is backed by the central bank and not just a transfer of funds mechanism. But what I do think is that CBDC again can be a very beautiful metric for financial inclusion. It can be a counter to cryptocurrencies. It can be a beautiful metric to do various sort of transactions. But it is very important that the mantra that we have, the kind of infrastructure that we create, and the legislation that we create should be very robust. And what potentially we could do is either A, go ahead and further amend our data protection bill to specifically deal with products in the financial industry like the CBDC and create some robust mechanisms. Or B, we can go ahead and create a CBDC specific legislation or a CBDC specific rule that makes it clear to the consumers and that makes it easy for the consumers to understand as well as the various stakeholders to understand. So I think that is it with my presentation. And of course, it was, again, I would like to thank Meta and all the various people that I've worked with for this wonderful opportunity. It was, I would say, truly one of the most exciting and one of the most scholarly things I've done in my law school. So thank you again, and I hope you like the presentation.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Kaartikay. I can really see the passion for what you're interested in and what you like doing coming through. So great job over there. And I am not by any means someone who understands fintech very well or UPI. I'm still trying to understand cryptocurrency 3 years later. So this is like a good overview of what the main issues are and what the main comparative points of reference are that we should be looking at when launching pilots like these across the country. And I do come from a background where I've studied a lot of international relations and I've studied India's position on a lot of these um, technologies as well. And as a layperson coming into this debate, and feel free to correct me if these assumptions or presumptions are wrong, but from my understanding, India has not been particularly welcoming towards private cryptocurrencies. They've kind of repeatedly, you've seen ministers and governments say these are being used as tools for money laundering, it's being used to finance terror, it's being used to sort of bring about anti-national quote unquote activities. And we sort of really need to regulate these things. And again, from my limited understanding, a state-backed currency like this is sort of an alternative that brings about some security while still allowing you to use the same kind of fundamental technology. So, A, I was just trying to understand, is that a correct presumption? And B, if that is, then what you're essentially looking at is bringing about regulatory insight and accountability over how the currency is traded and used in the country. So, is expecting this level of privacy, which you would typically have for some level of cryptocurrencies, is expecting this level of privacy a bit of a tall order? Because the whole premise here is that you're trying to curb something, or is it, a fundamental non-issue that you need certain baselines in place? So just those two questions to start off with.
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful question. So coming to firstly the aspect of cryptocurrency itself, uh, I think you put it quite rightly that cryptocurrencies and the entire idea is something that the government wants to counter through this. But like again, like cryptocurrency is something that no one really even knows what the exact legal stand of the government is, because initially we had a lot of discussion that cryptocurrencies are going to be banned, but then the government just issued a tax on them through the budget, and then there is still an entire gray area that cryptocurrencies have right now. And we have seen certain governments do who have gone ahead and banned cryptocurrencies. But in India, I do feel that the legal regulation is still gray. And we did see the entire Bitcoin bubble, the entire Dogecoin bubble, and how it suddenly burst, and then entirely the people who had bought into that entire idea, they had to go back. But I think what the difference it comes with CBDCs is, as I stated and as you stated also, is the fact that there is an element of state legitimacy here. The fact that these are digital currencies, but at the same time they are backed by the central bank, they are backed by the legal tender, and they're basically working at the same currency, but only in a digital format. So say compared to a Bitcoin, compared to other cryptocurrencies, they are actually have something tangible as a metric to compare themselves or secure themselves by. But just on the contrary, what I would also state is the fact that the element or the element of fascination that cryptocurrency had for a lot of people was also things like anonymity, things like the freedom it allows you to have, things like flexibility. And that is something that I'm not entirely sure whether a CBDC backed and regulated by the state will be able to have. So I think we will need to see how various stakeholders adopt to these mechanisms. And secondly, on the second part of your question regarding uh, privacy laws and whether it will actually happen. Again, I think that the idea and the entire question would land somewhere in gray. So I think we have certainly seen that the government has, gone ahead and give some certain reassurances. The RBI governor has continuously stated that privacy is something that, we seriously care about, and that is something we are going to inbuild into our entire mechanism. But at the same time, the entire question or the entire idea about what sort of data is going to be tracked, what sort of accountability metrics, what sort of transparency metrics are going to be built in by the government is not something that the government has yet very clearly detailed.
Mm.
And like when I was doing my project, of course, we did not have a very pilot program that was out. And I think very recently the government launched a program where even normal people like me can actually go ahead and access CBDCs on a pilot measure. So I think that we will have to wait and see on that question. But certainly, what the government is saying and the data protection bill that we now have, things are moving in a better direction. But whether they will be able to create a completely robust infrastructure is something that I feel we are going to have to wait and see.
So just to sort of sum up your answer, would you say that while you can have a privacy respecting CBDC, you can never have one that gives you that level of privacy or anonymity that private currencies do? Would that be a fair sum up of your argument?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair sum up, but I do think that we can achieve a balance. That I do think that we can go into a situation where, with certain proper mechanisms, we can achieve a balance between privacy, efficiency as well as security. And I think the golden triangle in that sense is something that can be achieved. But of course, like all stakeholders and all partners need to work on that together.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that, just to sort of clear those fundamentals. And another question I had, and this really comes down from your recommendations, where you say, on the one hand, you could potentially amend the data protection law to introduce specific provisions looking at CBDCs or E2Ps, or more perhaps realistically have a separate legislation that looks at their governance altogether. And I think the biggest question that I have in that case is really about sectoral overlap. And this isn't something that is foreign to the data protection law either. We're seeing it in the case of the provisions on cross border data flows in the law. It says that other prevailing regulators, whether it's most likely SEBI or the RBI, if they have certain provisions on data, then those prevail. And that's to ensure that the law doesn't intersect on someone else's institutional autonomy. So I think in my question here is, in an ideal hypothetical sense, how do you kind of create that regulatory harmony? If you have a separate law which looks at CBDCs and you have a data protection law, how should they ideally interact to ensure that there's no confusion for the industry and the people using it, and also just to ensure smooth regulation of the instrument itself?
Uh, so I think on that, well, certainly there are certain, first of all, legislations that can overlap. For example, you have the PMLA, you have FEMA guidelines, and these are certainly legislations that would come into play because, as I stated, the moment you start, engaging in big transactions, you start engaging in maybe cross-border transactions. The question will be that how do you go ahead and regulate that, right? How do you go ahead and ensure that someone is not just transferring a very big amount and not paying taxes, or just stashing their money in the form of CBDCs? And for that you will need to have these mechanisms and these metrics that also come into play. So I think the solution for that again would be to have a very specific CBDC based guideline that, okay, tomorrow if we have a very large transaction which is not accounted for, then these PMLA guidelines would come into action, and then this is the threshold that we have for bringing that law into action. Similarly for FEMA guidelines, that if the government is going to go ahead and, let's say, allow for example remittances in the form of tomorrow the e-rupee, then how are the FEMA guidelines going to work? How are the various aspects of various laws that India has going to work? And I think the solution for that is to create a comprehensive central bank based legislation that properly regulates the e-rupee and also gives a lot of clarity, right? Because the problem that we have right now is also that the RBI policy paper, or whatever has been stated by the government or the RBI, does not bring a lot of clarity. And what we do need is to have a legislation or a set of guidelines that make it absolutely clear as to what laws would apply and what the threshold of those laws applying would be. And that is, I certainly feel that something that should be done and is the way forward from here.
Okay, great. Well, that's helpful. And I think also gives you an idea of also the various use cases of different laws when regulating. I hadn't actually thought about remittances or how that would intersect with FEMA at all. So thanks for those points. That was really great. If you would like to learn more about Kartikay's work or any of the other scholars participating under this program, you can visit MediaNama's website or our YouTube channel to learn more about their research and watch their presentations as well. Thank you so much, Kartikay. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yes, thank you so much. It's also been a pleasure giving this presentation and hearing those wonderful questions from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.